Welcome to The Rippling Pages, a podcast on the craft of writing, crafted and created by me, Liam Bishop. Today, I'm joined by poet and now novelist Sam Sachs to discuss their novel, You're Dead, published by Daunt Books. Ezra is a queer Jewish person and is carrying out their last act of protest beneath Trump Tower in New York. It is not their last act of the day, nor is it their last act of protest. It is the last act of their life. What follows is a trip backward in time through some of the most significant and not so significant moments in Ezra's life. As you might expect for the award-winning poet that is Sam Sachs, it is at times an experiment in form as much as it is an experiment in writing about difficult subject matters. But You're Dead is dry and humorous as much as it is somber and melancholic. Sam is a winner of the National Poetry Series, the James Laughlin Award from the Academy of American Poets, and has appeared in publications such as Granta magazine. It goes without saying, today's episode does include discussions of a sensitive nature, so do take care and caution. But thank you very much for joining us. And of course, Sam, thank you very much for joining us on today's episode.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Liam. Great to meet you.
We'll get into it. And what I want to get into is this character, Ezra. I just wondered, who is Ezra and why this day in their life?
I mean, it's sort of like a cliche, isn't it? That like when you die, your life flashes before your eyes, you know? And so I think my initial entry point to this formal structure of this book was to like try to exploit and expand that as much as possible. Yeah. And so like have the world of the book happen in this sort of final moment of Ezra's life. And then through that, right, through that lens, you get to see through their like lived and embodied experience, like the ricocheted, fragmented memory of like what's made them who they are, in part what's led them to this final act of protest, but also largely just a confusion, I think, around the multiplicity of like all of the pieces that make up the complexity of the human life. And I think that to me feels like a more precise and accurate way that sort of memory and history work, right? Like they're all in sort of like complex embodied conversation that like history is kind of always alive in how we speak and how we move. I think for me, like Ezra as a character embodies that sense of wandering, right? Like I was thinking a lot about the figure of the flaneur. Maybe that's how you say it. I don't know my French accent shit. But yeah,
Yeah.
and so and like the sort of like Ezra's not really an artist, but they're like an outsider and they like view the world through this lens. And so I think there's a way in which they move through the world, like chasing pleasure but not finding it, seeing it from a kind of remove. That like to me also like is part of that tradition of the flaneur. And so I also think next to that, there's also like this question of sort of like movement and diaspora in Jewish tradition, and even like the sort of like figuration of like the quote unquote wandering Jew, right? So it's like the Jew that I think laughed at Christ's crucifixion and then was like cursed to wander, or like Cain or the biblical Cain, right? Who has to wander the earth, right? And so like, what does it mean to have to be both in exile and in movement? And what does that say about like your internal life? And so I think all like, there's a lot of like, yeah, I think all of these questions in my head were circling when I was thinking about the sort of formal structure about how like chronology and location sort of operate. My introduction to the idea of the flaneur came through Andrea Lawler's novel Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl, but it's like a protagonist that like can mutate and like change appearance and gender and and like body characteristics. So I think when I first encountered this, yeah, I mean I understand that's not like the tradition of it, but like when I first came to it I was like, oh, like what a sort of expansive, mutable, strange sort of archetype. And so I think I as Andrea sort of introduces it, I think about it more as sort of like a queer sense of outsiderness as well than like a particularly like masculinist or feminized sort of identity.
It's interesting that you say, and there's a few things to pick apart there, but it's interesting that you use the word flaneur. It's a very gender term, and there is the qualities wandering. You spoke a bit about desire there. Who is Ezra in terms of what the kind of qualities and the characteristics of him that, and how? Why did you choose to situate within this particular environment in this particular moment in time?
It's weird. I started the book in 2016, right after Trump's election, and I was going to all these protests then. And so I was like, let me situate it in this moment, right? That feels like really urgent and fragmented. And then that was what? That was like 7 years ago, 8 years ago. And so it was wild to like watch as I worked on this book it becomes sort of historical fiction, you know, like both in like its most contemporary setting and like how it moves back through time. And so I think like I wanted to locate it in like a very particular like charged present moment that then would like allow Ezra to like ricochet back both through their own life, but also through like this sort of like the lives of their parents and like in part their sort of like deep ancestral memory, right? And think about how all those things are intertwined and show up in the present of 2016, right? Or the present of today. Yeah.
Yeah, that's, I mean, for a novel that's so interested in time and how it moves and returns, it's got a very contemporary note at the moment, and it does make. I guess one of the questions that I had from the novel, and that perhaps that we have now, is, does history come back to haunt us? Ezra as a Jewish person. I know you've written about sort of because you have these moments throughout the novel as well, interspersed about that kind of. I'm not familiar with what they refer to necessarily, but that seem to sort of go back in history and in time. The kind of more fabulistic, allegorical sections, don't you?
I'm interested in sort of exploring the multiplicity of like Jewish identity in my writing for a lot of reasons. But one sort of important one is as a sort of like counter narrative to like statehood or Zionism, right? To show that there are these like grand complex traditions of like Jewish life and thinking that exist outside of right, how we might imagine a state, right? Or the settler colonial ideology that like undergirds Zionism. So I think that's like the larger political project that's kind of always alive in my work. I'm also really interested in like Jewish continuity. I think like alongside that, right? That so you've got like traditions of storytelling that constitute a people. Um, right. And so like for a people that's like historically displaced, right, or who came to their identity in diaspora, right, which is like Jewish people, like Judaism as a term gets its name from in exile, right? And so like the faith practice, I mean. And so like there's a lot of movement of people, and like it's through that movement that like the Jewish people become a people, is I guess my argument, right? Or meant a lot of people's argument, right, about diasporic Judaism or diasporism. And to me, that feels like really resonant with a lot of the thematic inquiries of the book as well, right? Like, how does Ezra, as a wandering character, hold on to their sense of self? How do they constitute their identity in relation to the history of these different traditions, right? And so I think that shows up in a bunch of ways in the book. One of which is like in their like childhood refusal of it. They're like confronted with a lot of different kinds of Judaism, I think, in the book, right? They got like they're sort of like pseudo-Marxist grandparents that they don't really identify with. Their like dad joins this like weird Hasid adjacent cult that like they don't really identify with, right? And so there's not like really a Jewish community for them in the world of the book, but like a lot of different sort of refractory faith practices that don't serve them, and yet, right, they have like this sort of through line of relationship and kinship to their Judaism. The sort of the the like through line folktale things that you're referring to, there's like throughout the book there are these like italicized invented Jewish folktales that sort of like break up the text. Yeah, and I think they do a lot of different things. And in my reading of it, I think it's like these are sort of the stories that their father invents for them before bed. And I think there's something about the imagined folktale as different from like archival history.
There's so much going on here then about kind of remembered legacies, and whatever happens posthumously to a person, however they're remembered, it becomes, as time goes on, it becomes a lot harder to remember someone, surely. And you've got these semi-fictional or partly fictional folk tales that stretch back to a very, very seem to stretch back to a very distant period in time. What came first, really? Did the death come first, or did these wider themes come first?
Yeah, I think I don't know. I heard folks talk about a novel as like you just kind of have to throw everything into it and then like winnow it back in order to like get a hold of the sort of imaginative breadth of the world of the book, right? Like what are the different materials that make up the sort of like sensuous qualities of the world of a novel? And that felt kind of resonant to me. I think for me, the formal constraint of the sort of the death that like led to these like fragmented memories was the container that allowed me to hold all of these things, and allowed me both to like explore a prose project in the size of a novel, but also like speak back and make sense of the sort of death of the main character. I don't know. And when I was first sitting with it, I was thinking there would be like, I feel like a traditional novel would sort of like end with the suicide, right? Or like end with this sort of like self-immolation or political act. And I was like, I don't know. I think like I was wondering what would happen if I put the sort of like climax of a traditional story at the beginning of a novel, and then what would open up from there. And I think a lot of this book to me feels kind of like an experiment following that question. Yeah, like what, like if there isn't sort of dramatic tension that leads to a sort of like traditional hero's journey narrative, right? Like, yeah, I guess are you asking about like whether Ezra needed to die for this book to happen, or like what?
Not necessarily. I think what I wonder. I guess I'm wondering if death is death seems to it sort seems to organize this novel to some extent.
Mhm,
It pins the character in a moment in time, and we
mhm,
see other deaths and we see other people that have died and they're referred to. And death, I guess, can be quite a disorganizing force.
yeah.
It can really, change and alter and shatter and do all kinds of things to different people's lives. And it really felt like the more you read this book and the further you get through it, you sort of, it feels like you're sort of gazing into the abyss to some extent. It's kind of the book really sort of gazes back into you. It really kind of pulls you into it. It sort of takes you in deeper, despite them not having this very linear narrative and that arc you said that you avoided.
I think, of course, on the other side of death is life, right? Not to be obvious and silly, but um, like as a Ezra as a main character is like the inheritance of like multiple streams of like of life, many of which they're judgmental of, many of which they're like resentful of these sort of like lived inheritances that like scaffold like the whole of their person, right? There's like this section where they talk about like after they die, they sort of like branch into the various sort of streams of their past. And I think we talk about it as like xylem flooding, right? Or like a sort of like a forest with like an underground root system and structure. And so I think there's like, yeah, I think there's a lot of like mm, complex and sort of connective potential that like death also offers, that it's not just a sort of destabilizing, dysregulating thing, but it's also like a truth for all of us, and something that yeah, right, is a part of all of our inheritance in one way or another. um and I think for Ezra too, like they're such a passive character, like so much of what happens in this book happens to them, outside of the sort of like, their final protest, right? Like their final gesture. And so there's a lot of ways in which like I think there's a complexity to their coming to this decision to take their own life that like I think holds like multiple difficult valences.
Yeah, as you say that, it's making me think of and someone that you do refer to in the novel, a Virginia Woolf's work, and there's often a lot of conflicting truths and conflicting narratives and lots of ideas about life and death and identities.
There's a lot of ways in which Ezra to me reminds me of Septimus from Dalloway, and that's where like the epigraph comes from. I mean, it's not like clearly a one-to-one thing, but I think when I was looking for a literary antecedent, that sort of Dalloway connect to me. And
And that
okay, and
wanderer quality as well, isn't it? He's the kind of the
mhm.
guy that the man that's sort of wandering around London, but he's got this trauma hanging off him, hasn't he? And that sort of influences, but it doesn't influence his movements in this day of. That's so interesting.
Yeah, well, when I came across that, I was like rereading with Dalloway, and then when I came across that passage, I was like, that is what needs to open the book. The one that goes like, the world wavered and quivered and threatened to burst into flames. It is I who am blocking.
Yes, yes. There's lots of physical desire.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and at one point you're right that of how being hungry for each other. It seems like Ezra's hungry for people, but sometimes that doesn't get reciprocated, doesn't it? Or
Mm-hmm.
it's not a yeah, it's not a it's not a dinner together, is it? Sometimes with some of these people, it's more of a taking what you can get kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in a lot of my creative life or my writing, I'm interested in like constructions of desire and like how we like the space that between like the sort of like embodied like libidinal or like need-based desires of the body, and how those sort of like butt up against constructions of identity and power in the world. And so I think like that for me is like my project, I guess. I don't know, in a lot of ways. And so I think in this book, hunger represents like a lot of things, right? I think there's like a desire for like placeness, right? And I think like Ezra often feels deeply out of place. I think there's like a desire for connection and for community and belonging. And I think often Ezra as a character is often on the periphery, right, of various communities of like feeling grounded as part of like a lineage or a home or a project. And so I think they look to fill that absence or that alienation through like sex with people, or through like joining like different like activist communities that then they sort of like immediately flee, right? Or like through relationship, or through like strange experience, or like ecstatic strange experience that then like fulfills them for a moment, and then they have to like go search for it elsewhere. And yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways for me, that desire for like belonging is like a comment, or a sort of critique of like whiteness as a constructed identity, and like the ideas of like individualism, of like Jewishness, like white Jewishness assimilation into like the project of America. And so I think there are like these larger sort of like political and identitarian questions that are circling Ezra, that like leads them to like feel sort of dislocated, and desire for connection. Yeah.
It's really make. I don't know if you've read the. It's come to my mind actually. I don't know if you've read the French writer Hervé Guibert. To the friend that did not save my life.
I have read that
Have
book.
you ever
I
read
have.
that?
Okay, yeah, the Foucault book.
Yes, yeah,
Isn't
yeah.
that
Foucault,
yeah?
yeah, 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 yeah. His friend is Foucault. His musil, isn't he, in the book? Which is written about his. I think it was his final book before his death, and you've got these kind of, and that writes a lot about relationships that Hervé has.
You know, I
If I
read
missed the
that book
mark,
in college, I think.
okay,
I haven't returned to it in a while. And mostly we just passed it around and read about it for all like because we were all new to Foucault, and I think we were all looking for
okay,
things to like
okay.
and we like the yeah, and I remember we were reading the sections aloud where like Foucault shows up in like the gas mask and stuff, or like leaving the class. Yeah.
Fair enough. Death's at the core of that novel.
Yeah.
And you've got these kind of these a lot of these kind of relationships that the writer engages in, but
Yeah, yeah,
a
yeah.
real sense of sometimes a lack of intimate connection in terms of, and he seems to really miss, doesn't he, Foucault? Okay, we're gonna have a quick break on the Rippling Pages. Do come back. We're gonna talk to Sam more about their novel You're Dead. If you're enjoying today's episode, why not leave a 5-star review on your favorite podcast provider? I know I ask this every time, but I really do appreciate it when you do so. It lets me know that you're enjoying it. It lets me know that you're enjoying the writers and the guests that we have on this show. And it, of course, boosts the audience for these fantastic writers as well. And we'll see you for the second half very soon. Well, welcome back. We're going to get straight back into it with. I want to get into this idea though of well, it's not an idea, but I want to get into the narrator's parents, if you don't mind, and what Ezra remembers and refers back to quite a lot is their mother leaving. And there's lots of moving moments and lots of beautifully and poignant moments in this book, and some of them and quite a lot of them do come from uh, this Ezra's relationship with the mother. And whereas there's a lot about loss, it felt like there's quite a lot here about lack, the lack. So Ezra seems to really miss their mother, don't they?
Yeah, I think there are a couple sections that are like, yeah, where where her absence is like particularly loud. I also think there's a way in which she represents a kind of autonomy of movement and choice to sort of divest from like inherited structures of knowing, right? Like she leaves the family, which is like both really heartbreaking for Ezra, but also I think provides a kind of a path into like a sort of example of how you can sort of divest, right, from these sort of like inherited structures and obligations. So I think there's like a deep loss that they carry, like particularly navigating some of their financial inheritance in and around the mother. yeah, and showing up in the sort of memory of like how her disappearance affects like the whole sort of structure of the family, like from the extended family down to like their sort of internal family unit. But yeah, I think there's a way that her absence like is a kind of grief, but also is like a kind of permission to sort of choose the self, right? If you're like dissatisfied, right, with the sort of structures that you exist inside of.
Yeah, that's when you really articulate the absence of, for whatever she represents. You really articulate the absence of them. But that's such a fascinating way of putting it. She represents this autonomy of movement. Why does she have that, and why does no one else seem to have that?
I mean, I think for her, there's like, why does no one else seem to have it? I don't know if I don't know if other people don't have it, but I think like she's the closest person to Ezra that does sort of choose something else, right? And it's also like a fracture and choosing herself that like causes sort of pain in others, but like there's a kind of profoundness, I think, in like choosing yourself even if it harms other people. And there's also like a kind of callousness and like cruelty to it as well. There's a section where she like comes back a handful of times and like in each return she's like living inside another life, right? And she's like, and it's like each represented by a haircut. um and then at the end of it, it's like when it's like we both sort of decided to give up on these scripts, right? And I think there's something about it that's like highlighting that the family unit and structure is also a construction, right? And there are a lot of ways you can like build out your life, right? And a lot of ways families can be built and made.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think Ezra is like searching for family throughout the whole book, and doesn't find it. I don't know. I think there's like a kind of autonomy that the mother sort of takes because, I mean, you like slowly see her lose her mind a little bit, right, throughout some of this book, right? Or you get like glimpses of like how sort of destructive this being in this family was for her, right? And I think Ezra two names like she decides to like go do her own thing, right? Like that there is like I can't be mad at her for choosing something else, like for choosing her survival. And I think there are a couple ways that mirrors too, like like the sort of the history of exile of like that Ezra has inherited too, right? To choose your survival over the obligations that you have around you. Yeah.
I mean, there's some beautiful language in this book, but and you really seem to be able to, because you go through different parts of Ezra's life as we've identified, but you articulate a discourse that might be more identifiable from an earlier part of Ezra's life. You write about when their mothers left. When no one comes to comfort me, when I realize there's no one left to cry for, I go make myself a peanut butter sandwich. Even before she left, she was already gone. It's very melancholic. It's very pathos, sort of written, but it really goes inside the mind of that young child. And you're talking about refracted identities
Mm.
and how we sort of carry these identities with us, even if we might be moving, if we are technically older in years. And I think that's what makes it for me so poignant. Some of those moments, and I really responded to some of those. But this book makes me think about legacy. Perhaps because there is, it's the legacy of Ezra. But there's quite neat and quite cute in terms of how he writes about it. As Ezra is a bookseller, um, and we see people bringing in books to sell from their partners' estates who died. And there's one moment where someone is sort of can't believe that all of these books of their partner who sadly died, they're now worthless and they're just worth nothing. And Ezra sort of sees this every day, and it just made me think about the complexities of a literary legacy,
Mm.
but also kind of what we leave behind in general and what the value of it is.
Love that read. Thank you. I would say that's one of the central sort of threads and questions of the book, right? Is like thinking about, I mean, it ties into that question of like belonging in place, right? Like what's like what is your inheritance and what do you leave behind, right? And what are the ways you make meaning on this earth that is like sprinting toward extinction, right? And how do you make a meaningful life, right? Like so these are like a lot of the questions that are moving throughout Ezra's movements in the world of the book. Um, the section at the bookstore, I worked as a bookseller during COVID, during the like lockdown rather, for like a year and change. And I think that was we kept getting this experience of like folks selling the libraries of like their dead relatives, right, who had died of COVID, right, or who were fleeing because of the pandemic. And then I think that was just like a really like profound and disarming experience that I had every time I was selling these books, right? Or like was trying to buy these books from people. It was like here is like a life's worth of intellectual care and curiosity and profound spiritual engagement that's like when sort of put in a system of like capital is like rendered meaningless, you know? And so yeah, I think that's what a lot of the sort of like dominant systems of like meaning making, whether it's like capitalism or whether it's like systems in capitalism like academia or whatever, like can reduce like the profundity of our lives, right, to these like sort of narrow, I don't know, to like to change, right? Like small bills in your pocket. Um, and so like, yeah, there's like a couple sections where like Ezra tries to make like a section of the book where they like praise the sort of marginalia of like dead people. They like yeah, oh, folks write in like the margins of their books and like have that be like a sort of like highlighted, like occluded like thing to like to lift up and praise and like to offer value to. And so yeah, I think a lot of their experience in the bookstore is thinking about both like literary inheritance, but also like intellectual and spiritual inheritance, and like what how we highlight and give value to the different sort of like objects or experiences in our life.
Well, there's just a line that I've got here. It's quite very, very dark humor at times in this book. They aren't books at all. There is only the body of the dead man she's lost,
Mm.
laid out in the green and pristine dust jacket. Did these ideas about that formulate when you were a bookseller?
Yeah, I think the used bookstore is a really fascinating site of like both like commerce and also like regional history. You know what I mean? Like there's like region like
Yeah,
a
yeah,
youth
yeah.
bookstore in a community has like local authors that aren't sort of canonized elsewhere. There's a way in which like books that are out of circulation and like traditional publishing like have this like second resurrected life there, places. And I think there's a way in which a text survives outside of its like um yeah, a text survives in a used bookstore that reminds me a lot of like sort of Jewish continuity, right? That there's like this like that it's like the story or the book that has value and has the the ability to keep a narrative or a person or a people alive. And I think there's like some like sort of tendril there that connects Ezra to these spaces, to their history.
Is it what is that? Is that the act of reading, or is that more the act of writing or engaging with the texts? Or is it the
Yeah,
fact that you've written about Ezra? Or...
I don't know. I mean, I think there are ways in which stories are like portals or time traveling devices, right? I mean, and the text changes over time, of course, like every time you engage it, but like there's a way in which it's like a document that like locks the past in place and like allows it to travel into the present. Um, there's a way it can connect you to the interior lives of those who are no longer alive, right? And that you're like in dialogue with ghosts in a way, like or getting to read the sort of yeah, the sort of like language practices of the dead, you know?
These books and these writers, and you said that some of them, the more local bookstore, that some of those writers might not make massive ripples outside of the local area, but they sue. There's nothing to say that some of these voices would never go out of existence, and
Mm.
their ripples might be enduring. And maybe that's the enduring power of writing a book, and and I think this is where there is a hopeful message in this book, isn't there? And I think
Mm.
this is one of the avenues in which it comes through.
That's beautiful.
Okay.
The Thanks for telling me about the yeah. I think of it like as quite a hopeful book. I mean, despite it being about a death. Um, I think there's something in Ezra's like yearning toward like a livable future, toward connections with other people, toward like sustained life in the face of like um extractive and exploitative systems and climate devastation and the rise of fascism that to me feels like quite hopeful. Like I think in writing about a thing like there's always it's like its opposite becomes is present and loud, and so I think like in the fact that this is a book that circles a death like means it's a book about life, right? And like so it wants to like sort of highlight and celebrate, I think, what the ways that
It's meditative, is it? It's quite meditative in that respect. It sort
Mm,
of makes you sit with these issues and consider them, and that's that's what books can do. But and I don't think, as someone myself who is I'm not a religious person, or I've not come from a religious family or anything like that. And I don't know if this is something that perhaps comes from perhaps a more religious culture or religious upbringing, sort of thinking about death. But I don't think it's something that we do too often, for obvious reasons. But I think fiction has been a really good way for me to do that, and I don't think I've got that. There's really whatever your views on religion and whatever wherever you view whatever, there is a death is an element to it, isn't it? Death and life in the afterlife is a constituent element of a lot of different religions, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think like every sort of religious, faith-based, or like cultural practice has a different orientation toward death, you know? And I think all of them are instructive and interesting.
Yeah, instructive. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, we are finishing on quite a hopeful note, even though we're finishing on.
Yeah.
What I would say actually is, you've got to listen to Sam's and watch some of their performances on YouTube. It really is a fantastic poetry performance, and you've won awards for that, haven't you? Your poetry performance, as well as your poetry performance. Have you got any events? We have American listeners. Have you got any events planned or anything like that?
Yeah, I'm going on this like 9-city tour. I'm going to New York, Philly, Providence, Boston, Western Mass, Portland, Seattle, LA, and the
Oh,
Bay.
wow.
Yeah.
That sounds very exciting. Some great
It's
cities.
gonna be really tiring. I gotta make sure I have enough good outfits to the trip. Yeah, and then hopefully make it out to y'all's country at some point.
Definitely.
You know, haven't been
Well,
to
so that'd be
great.
great. Hopefully, we get you over to the UK. And but if not, if you're in the States, if you're in any of those cities, catch Sam talking about You're Dead. Otherwise, and there is an 8 hour time difference here as well. So thanks for we've pulled it together. But I want to say, Sam Sax, I really you obviously you learn about people's work through doing podcasts like this. But you also really do become a fan of people's work as well, and really getting immersed in it. So, and that's what's happened here. And, Sam, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thanks for being so open about some of the really deep issues that your book presents. But for now, You're Dead is published by Daunt Books in the UK, McSweeney's in the US, and it's coming out in August.
Yay. Thank you so much.